All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the Team Poland 40k podcast, where we focus on competitive Warhammer 40,000 in team setting. I am Pumba. I'm a member of the national team and the current team selector for 2023 season for WTC, that is. And with me today, I have a very special guest. It is Danny Porter, Team Poland coach, GSC expert, Chaos Space Marines enjoyer, and Leagues of Votann testing machine. Hello, Danny. Nice to have you.
Hey, Chaos Space Marines enjoyer. That's very nice.
Doubler. Chaos Space Marine Doubler.
Doubler, yes, doubler. Hey, thank you for having me.
No problem, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be, as you have probably seen from the title of the episode, reviewing the big spooky Leagues of Votann Codex, which came out, was it like 2 weeks ago at this point?
2 weeks ago, yeah, about 2 weeks ago.
Pretty much, right? And there was a lot of talk about it, how strong it is, how completely overpowered it is. And today we will be discussing it not as a thorough review. We won't be delving deep into each stratagem, each data sheet. There are other sources where you can find such reviews that are great to listen to as well, of course. One of which is definitely Art of War Down Under podcast, hosted by Adam Calmieri, a great friend of ours. And we highly recommend that type of review as well. Instead, what we will be doing is reviewing this codex in the context of team play as a whole. What is the potential for Leagues of Votann in team play? How strong are they after the nerfs, which is important? We will be focusing the most of what the current situation in the game is. Unfortunately, it is still talks before the data slate because GW just refuses to release the goddamn thing for weeks now. But hey,
Yes, that is kind of annoying, isn't it?
it really is. It really grinds everybody's gears that they cannot actually play the proper new meta that we are all waiting for.
hmm
That is a thing that's happening. All right, Danny. So on to you. You will be my actual expert today. I have some experience in Leagues of Votann. I have played like 10 or maybe 12, up to 15 games with it, but all of them have been before the nerfs. And I have some of my own opinions. I've
hmm
seen you play some games, but what is your actual experience with the Codex?
So pre-nerf, I did 46 games, and post-nerf, I've done about 22 as of yesterday, and that's mostly because I think people just not interested in playing against the army. Now they've got a bit of a sour taste, and yeah, the popularity is not really there. I think people are a little bit scared for no reason at all.
That is a lot of goddamn games. Just that's all I'm gonna fucking say, man. That is a lot of games.
My record is still about 30 games in 1 week when Gene Stealers dropped. Thank God for TTS.
Thank God for TTS indeed. Holy Jesus. Um, Basically, you have been talking about sour taste that Leagues of Votann have associated with it, and the fact that people might still not want to play against it. And that is probably because the state the codex released in at the start of the month or whatever, or like half of for half of the previous month. So before the nerfs, you have like 46 games experience with it.
Mhm.
What is your actually, if we can just go back to that time, what is your opinion of the decks when it came out? Remember, we're talking team setting. Like, how unbeatable, how completely broken were they?
In terms of a team setting, they're not unbeatable, or they weren't broken in a sense. In the same sense that perhaps Harlequins aren't broken, because as you know, we've been doing a lot of sparring with different countries, and we sat down and we had a look at what are the good matchups based on what experience I've had with the army so far, and what are the bad matchups. And there was no 8 green pairings, especially against Spain. We actually had 2 orange pairings in the sense of the Harlequins, and I can't remember what, I think it was Necrons. So for a team setting, before the army actually got nerfed, I already thought, well, they're not they're not balanced in the sense that they are a little bit too strong, but they're not gonna break a team meta. They're not and they're not an army, or they never were at the time, that can just steamroll 20-0 unless you've got a really good green pairing. And there was a lot of light green and a lot of sort of 12 to 15s, but there was not that many 20-0s, I would say.
So basically, it is very important to mention here for our listeners, especially that team format generally, it's one of their biggest strengths, in my opinion, is that the fact that if there is one army that is clearly broken or just very, very good, you will expect every single team attending your given tournament to bring them on, right? Which definitely makes team format and team tournaments as a whole a different experience. You would normally have this problem in singles events that, well, I have army X that is let's take another random army. I have Craftworld Elder, for example, and I'm bringing only Craftworld Elder. And if Leagues of Votann Codex was actually that broken, I would be expected to play against them several times. And let's say I was not favored in that matchup, for example. In team formats, you will always have that safety net, let's say, that every single team will have that broken army. And because of that, you must be, first of all, prepared for it. Second of all, you are probably bringing it as well. So there's actually still level playing field in a sense that one game of Leagues of Votann just crushing somebody, which might happen, of course, is not going to decide the whole outcome of the game.
Absolutely.
Yep. So moving on into the current Leagues of Votann and the main topic and the thing that we will be focusing the most on. After your experience with them right now, what are the current strengths and weaknesses of the army as a whole? We will not be focusing for now on specific armies that deliver that, for example, but what is there during the game? What do they struggle against? What are their things that they can focus on to beat their opponent very nicely?
All right, I think let's focus on strengths and weaknesses, because I think this is one of the most perhaps contentious topics where a lot of people might not necessarily agree on this one. So for me,
I mean, let's make it clear. We do not care about other people's opinions right now. I want your honest take, and this is something we will be focusing on this podcast as a whole. This is non-TOS, non-fucks given podcast in that sense of we want only like the edgiest fucking takes. I really don't care if you have a controversial opinion. I think it is valid with your experience and something that people might benefit from.
okay, let's talk about some controversial opinions. I think right. So let's talk about the strengths. The biggest strength for me is the army is super mobile, and that sounds really weird because it's a bunch of dwarves that move at 5 inches. However, I found the units that best work are the ones that move 12 inches and can just, especially with the pre-game on the bikes. So for me, one of the biggest strengths is the mobility. You, especially if you run bikes, you're able to go 12 inches pre-game move. You're able then to go another 12 inches in your movement phase itself. So you're able to go from one end of your deployment to the other end of the board quite safely and quite aggressively. So that is very good at punishing players and poor deployment for a start. I think that's really good. The alpha strike potential of Votann is quite good if you're leaning into bikes and things like that. Not to mention, if you everything has a maximum advance move. So there's always that, how to say it, you've always got that specific movement that you go. If you need to calculate and say, right, I need to be over here exactly 24 inches, you know you can go that 24 inches. You're not relying on a dice roll. For me, that is really good, and I think that is one of the strongest strengths, especially when things like bikes have obsec. And I found in a lot of games I've been able to use that to steal objectives or just move, say, 12 inches, get a line of sight is really good. The drawback of that obviously is the army cannot advance and shoot, cannot advance and move. or cannot advance and shoot and charge or do actions, but being able to have that exact movement, some might say is a drawback. I think it's fantastic, especially when you cannot be slowed.
If I may, that's very interesting and something I can definitely attest to after testing them initially after the release. I think one of the things that everybody expected them to be is very immobile, and it just turns out that they have so many units that can actually, if you take the proper units, it turns out the army is actually very mobile. But
Mm-hmm.
the thing that is lacking, as you said, and that is, I think, their weakness at the same time, they're reliable, extremely reliable with their auto advances, not being slowed down by any difficult terrain stuff and such. But because of that, are they perhaps a little bit predictable?
I think the predictability is definitely in the drawback of the mobility. It's very easy to say, right, this unit maximum is going to go 12 inches and shoot me at 36-inch range. So I can absolutely be 36.1 away and I'm safe. I think that predictability does give a lot of agency to the opponent because they don't have to, they can be comfortable in their assessment of the game. It's not like, say, you can you can advance like d6, and the opponent has to either then assess, is he going to go the full 6, and then do I need to be plus extra 12 inches away for the charge? It's a little bit more safer for their assumptions and their estimations on how they create a measure. So I think that is a massive drawback in this sense. But on the flip side from that, the fact that you also have this, that you can go 12 inches on a lot of units, for me is still really good, especially when a lot of the weapons are 24 inches as well. That 36-inch threat range for me is absolutely sublime.
Yeah, basically, I completely see what you mean. Because when I was testing the army, I found them to it's weird to say, even especially when I was playing them in their like strongest form, but they do give agency to the opposing player, I feel like. Um Also, what do you think about the core mechanic of judgment tokens? Because in my opinion, in my experience at least, or maybe not experience, because when I was playing against people, they obviously were super new and not everybody knew how to deal with them, which is also a thing that happens with every single codec that comes out, and is something very natural, of course. But still, even if you're winning your games, you potentially see the cracks in your build and in your logic and the cracks in the army you are playing as. I feel that like this happens a lot to me, at least.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the core mechanic of judgment tokens is actually something that is very abusable by your opponent, and something that also gives them a lot of room to play around you.
I'm so seeing as we do accept hot takes, I'm going to give a hot take now. I think this mechanic is really good and also one of the worst in the game.
Interesting.
So yeah, auto wounding is very strong. So if you can auto wound on sixes, five, fours, etc., is very strong.
Undeniably.
Absolutely. And if we're going to be absolutely honest, there's no room for it in the game as such. It shouldn't be a thing. However, it is, and we've got to accept that. But at the same time, you are also actively punished for your system. For instance, sisters, miracle dice. If their system is built around miracle dice, there's no way for the opponent to interact with that. In fact, in many cases, the opponent has to plan for this, and it can really put them on the back burner. The same with Harlequins and their dice, or Craftworlds and their dice. Death Guard, there's no real way for, it's not an awe or anything like that. There's no way for an opponent to counter that, in essence, right? The problem with the Votann tokens is that it's absolutely abusable. And don't get me wrong, if a player does not know how it works and they don't really have they're not able to look into the aspect and plan around it, then yes, it's a really strong system. But let's be fair, a lot of players are smartening and wisening up to this system, and for example, if you throw a token on somebody because they're doing an action, I've seen players use that on a character. For example, they'll use characters to put down banners, characters that have protection and can't be shot, so that token's wasted. Or if it's, they'll have tokens, they'll use characters to hold objectives and have actually units not on there that is vital. it becomes really abusable because it's actually quite hard to stack up against really skilled players that know what they're doing.
And especially that you have those main ways of gaining those judgment tokens that you can play around. I think also in list building, I think this is something to take advantage of, is that small MSU units don't give a crap if they have a judgment token of them. So why would you not put up your banner with just some chaff, right?
Exactly. Like if I'm playing GSC, I played GSC against Votann 4 times and I've comfortably won 4 times. And that's because, well, I can put 45-point acolytes onto to do my Nagmun data, my Nephilim data. I can throw a truck onto an objective, and who cares if you shoot a truck? The units outside will then get on the objective and score that in my turn anyway. And or characters can come along and do psychic interrogation, but who cares because there's no way apart from one specific character build, which is rubbish anyway, to ignore Lookout Sir. So there's a lot of ways, a lot of armies can actually just play around this system. And I think as more and more players sort of learn how to do that and adapt to that, and like you say, they build their lists into it because they probably should. It's gonna sort of impact how Votann are used in teams as well, I think.
Very nice, very interesting. All right, moving on. You have been testing a lot, as we've discussed. Now, what is, in your opinion, the current strongest build for team format? Something that, given the opportunity, would you bring to any sparring match, a WTC, any international or Polish team event?
That's a good question, actually, because originally my estimations were around like 3 fortresses or 2 fortresses, and then once the nerf hit, we were thinking, well, actually, how can we start going back into these fortress builds? However, I think fortress builds are more singles orientated now rather than teams. They don't really have a niche where they can counter something relevant in the meta.
I'm very sorry. I will just jump in here and interrupt for a second just to explain to everybody. When we were discussing Leagues of Votann in general and probably any other future releases, we will be talking about playing almost exclusively WTC terrain layouts and scoring in 20-0 team formats. It is something that is definitely going to impact the way we think about them, and especially the terrain, I feel like, especially relevant with this army.
I'm glad you mentioned that, actually. That is really helpful.
Yeah, no problem, man. Continue, please.
Yeah, this is so originally my estimation was fortresses will be fantastic in team play because you can play that more passive, you can either play a deny role or you can play that more aggressive list and try and beat armies that you can table. However, when the points drop hit and you can't actually field enough to really push fortresses out there, I think they've now become a singles build. And actually what I'm looking at more now, for especially for teams, is the whole using Sagittarius. And so it's either Sagittarius spam with dwarves, berserkers in there, mostly because I think that counters a lot of armies like Necrons. It counters a lot of armies like Harlequins, and we can talk about a bit more why later. So I think that's one build, but then there's also another build that's centered around just taking half guard terminators and some fortress, one fortress, and then some Sagittars, which is a build I've been testing, because that also can do quite well into armies like Tyranids, which obviously we've not got a data slate for yet, but also into things like Tau, etc. So I don't think there is one strongest build. I think right now there's quite a couple or maybe 3 builds, but there's nothing that, yeah. So I think you've got to look at what armies you want to sort of counter and then build that way. So like my preference right now is absolutely trying to deal with Harlequins because I think it is a skill matchup that a lot of armies can't deal with. So I think the whole idea of Berserkers and Sagittars sort of play a similar game. However, they can survive a little bit better, I would say. And then they've got also quite good scoring potential in that build. But then, yeah, I've been looking at half guard as well, and I think they've got
At 45 points each.
it's yeah, it's 45 points. However, the board control aspect that it brings, especially with the being able to teleport one unit, being able to drop down, and not require Chapter Master rerolls because they do an obscene amount of shooting damage, shooting pressure that they put out, especially with the Volkite and the grenades. Tailored with the fact that actually they are quite
With the grenades, what do you mean exactly?
they have two weapons. They have the grenade launcher that is always on there, and then they've got either the Volkite disintegrator or they've got the plasma.
Oh, I see. I was not aware actually that they had another weapon besides the Volkite.
Yes, they have two weapons.
Never got around to playing them before the nerfs.
Yeah, no, they were a lot better post pre nerf, of course. But right now the whole idea of them is that they're really good at just dropping down, providing quite a lot of pressure, and then just sort of sitting there, and the opponent has to deal with them, and that takes a lot of strain off, say, your pioneers or your Sagittars, who can sort of start taking the mid board or sitting on objectives, etc. So I'm finding quite a good amount of success with that as well.
All right. You're saying there isn't a singular strongest build, which is very interesting and gives a lot of perspective to begin with. Let's say I would task you. You've discussed the Harlequins matchup, which I believe as well are one of the strongest armies in the entire game right now. And still, we are talking pre-data slate. Hopefully, they get just trashed in that.
Fingers
But
crossed.
current, fingers crossed, exactly. Uh, but let's say I want you to bring a build to complement my team in a way that I can counter and pin Harlequins in the Pryings process. What are you exactly bringing? Well, which type of which league are you actually bringing? What's more or less in the build?
So if I wanted to tailor it into Harleys, we're talking like something like 5 Sagittars, maybe 20 or 25 Berserkers, and then some bikes. And this would be in EMEA. And the reason why I say that is because Sagittars at 9 wounds with a 5 up invulnerable save and toughness 7 is quite a lot to chew through.
That is a tough nut to crack. Something definitely, yes.
It's a tough nut to crack, and I think that they are easier at opening up Harlequin boats at range than Harlequin boats are at opening them up at range.
Yeah, they need to get close, right?
Exactly. And then what that does then is that forces the Harlequins to be a lot more aggressive because they're going to lose the range game quite comfortably. And they need to, they win quite well on secondaries, but they need to be aggressive on the secondaries. And so if they're a lot closer, that means that even if they do pop a Sagittar, you've got bikes, you've got your berserkers inside that can go and then cause a lot of havoc. And I found in sort of matchup so far, it's quite good at opening up boats from range. However, it obviously is quite map intensive. If it's quite a dense map, it gives a bit more agency to the Harleys because of the speed and the fact that they fly, etc. However, the durability of it's also the fact that the dwarves, the berserkers, get a 5 up invulnerable save themselves. Plus, they also get the feel no pains, which can shrug off quite a bit of say the damage too from the shooting or the melee from the troops, or even just the mortal wounds.
Yeah, just tanking the neuro pistols, right? Yeah,
Exactly.
that's good. All right, I will have I have my own opinions about that. I've played a very similar build to this pre-nerfs. Of course, it was wider and broader and was general stronger because it had just more units in it. I've played 2 games against Harlequins, I believe, and I have a question for you. In your games, don't you find that Harlequins in general, and especially bows, can just outmaneuver the Sagittars in a way that you are not able to actually shoot them? And because of that, they can stay outside of your threat range, very much so, score pretty well. And if you try to engage them in close combat, especially with Berserkers, which I mean, from disembarking from the Sagittar is only 8 inches, and then you're rolling a charge. And we, of course, are talking about playing Harlequins with light Sadeath, so we are talking what is it, like a 6-inch jump when you try to charge them? Don't you find that to be a problem?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of problems in the fact that there is a lot of agency on the Harleys player. They are able to use their mobility and play around the mission. However, if they take their usual, they take their deadly performance, they take their behind enemy lines, etc., and then they take their what is it? They've got their psychic action. I find that a lot of times they do have to go quite aggressive to be able to do some scoring as well. But also the bikes, our bikes play really well into this, especially if there's a dense map, because they can just go and sit on an objective, and if they're hidden, a boat can't just come and fly on that objective and take it because they're obsec. What I find is if you can play this to your advantage, and you can force them. If you take quite passive secondaries like perhaps banners, and then you take something like warp ritual, which is quite actually a bit of a mistake. I wouldn't say that, but psychic interrogation can also be a mistake. But you could take.
That's the problem, right?
We never covered weaknesses, and this is the big weakness.
Because it is very hard to slot like good secondaries, especially versus armies that have supreme secondary play like Harlequins, perhaps Sisters and such.
Yeah, this is what I mean. We never covered weaknesses, and the biggest weakness I would have picked on is scoring potential. It is really low, really limited. The secondaries are just really bad. I would say this though, against Harleys, I would take Lay. Lay
I mean,
Flame.
not every secondary, right? I mean, there's the one where you score for each judgment token. Don't you find that one to be at least good?
Yeah, unless if I don't table my opponent, then all their characters that have taken all of these actions and taken their judgment tokens are just going to scuttle off, run away, and every model or unit, sorry, that survived at the end of the game, you're minus 1 point.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, yeah, I can see that happening.
So against an army like Harley's, where the Shadow Sayers are going to start ramping up tokens, I don't think it's worth taking. What I do like though is Lay Claim. If
Mhm.
you can play, I find it works quite well against Harlequins because
Which one is that? So, because that's very specific now.
Lay Claim is the one where your opponent has to put down 3 objective markers. One, and I think it's on the middle. I don't think it's in their deployment. I think it's in the middle of the board.
I believe it's 6 inches. It must be 6 inches from their deployment zone and
Yes, and
six
then from
inches
the edge. Yeah,
from.
the edge, and 9 inches away from each other, I believe.
So basically, on most of the deployment types and missions, you are talking the very middle of the table, just slightly into your opponent territory.
Exactly. And while that sounds counterintuitive, what I've found is actually, even if you go first, if you are able to use your bikes a bit more defensively and not throw them forward and have them die, but keep them back, force the opponent to have to come and kill them bikes. If they don't, as the game progresses and you're like removing bolts, you're removing troops, the chances of them killing them bikes towards the end of the game diminishes as the game goes on. So you can then, towards the end of the game, advance them their 12 inches, their 6 inches, get onto them objectives and their obsec.
Yeah.
So if you play the game correctly, you can probably get 10 points from this. Quite solid. And then obviously if you've got if you do want to take ancestors, like you've said, that is still maybe a solid 12 points as well. And then there's perhaps, I don't know, maybe psychic interrogation. I've been trying to figure out what the third secondary is, but sometimes
It is a struggle, right?
yeah, exactly. That is obviously the power of Harleys. It is quite hard to get secondaries. If you're not got passive ones, it's hard to get any secondaries that score well into them.
Yeah, I find generally that it is a common story across this Nephilim meta that you either have a faction that just picks random 3 secondaries, mainly from their book. We are talking Sisters, Necrons, Harlequins as well, fit in that, I think, because they have a supreme secondary play. And the factions that get like, they probably take one of their faction secondaries, you probably take banners, and you either can afford yourself to pick your psychic secondary, or against an army that you cannot do that against and doesn't actually give out any good points from killing, you are suddenly struggling. And I found this is a thing with many armies in this Nephilim meta.
Absolutely.
It's very common, right?
Yeah, and this is a problem that I think Votann really struggle with. But saying that, banners is always pretty good against them, especially if, well, it can and it cannot be, because sometimes obviously they can just come get troops out and try and take an objective off you.
I mean, that is a That's always the case with banners. That's something that you must allow yourself to risk, I believe. Actually, I have a very specific question here because when testing with Votann, I found that they don't actually have good units to put banners up with, especially in the first turn. What do you usually use to do that?
For me, I usually in most lists I have like 10 Halfkin because patrol just to save the CP.
Mhm.
And it allows you to. This is another problem with the army is that the list building is a massive headache because some of the best units are in the fast attack, which is not the most. You don't get a lot of fast attack options outside of a battalion, and even then you only get 3. So a lot of times you find yourself taking an outrider, and then you'll have a patrol, so you can get a few more extra elites in there. And that's usually how my list looks in every list.
It's an outrider patrol army. You really don't need the troops.
Yeah, exactly. So I always have usually 10 halfkin, and what I'll do is I'll start them in one of the 2 Sagittars. So then we've got a split. So then 5 are going to get out and they'll get onto the backfield objective with the medic, and then 5 will stay in another Sagittar. And the job of them is usually move with that Sagittar. Berserkers will have to follow, unfortunately, the best they can. Sagittar will pick them up later, but it's either going to go and drop them off at a flanking objective and they can go do banners, or I'll have to use them as a screen, especially if there's a mortal wound army, and I will use the Einher champion who can go and do banners, because he can also he can either use the teleport, because I'll always take the teleport crest on him because for 1 CP he can just go anywhere on the board.
Yep, very useful.
Very useful. So, and he drops down at the end of the movement, so he can just teleport turn 1, go to a flanking objective, go there, drop a banner, and we've got 2 up turn 1, which works out quite well. And then the opponent has to come and deal with a Einher champion, which is quite hard to kill.
Yeah, he's very like sustain heavy and wounds heavy and generally a bitch to kill through. I found
-1 damage, -1 to wound, with a 2 up armor save and 5 wounds and toughness 5 is very good.
generally as a Space Marine player, still looking at HQs from that army and generally any new HQ released makes me want to cry. But hey, that is the thing of ninth edition.
That is the 9th edition. If you're the first codex, you get the crap.
I mean, it is a. I think it was the thing in all of the editions, so
hmm
accepted it already. All right. So we have that build which we focused on, and perhaps we can focus on it for now a little bit more. As an army, maybe this build or in general, and because of their strengths and weaknesses, and I think one of the weaknesses we haven't actually discussed yet, but I think we will have an opportunity to do that now, is talking about how they deal with mortal wounds, right? Because they just don't.
Yep. Yep.
Because the thing is, they just don't do that. So delving into the matchups, if I want to take them into my team, what can they deal with? What do I need to completely avoid? What they will struggle against, and what they can just beat on the spot? And that's an easy 20.
Okay. Let's start with matchups they really can't deal with. So the biggest weakness that the army has is the fact that they're now 21% more expensive than they were. On average, my list has 11 units. Almost all of my lists have 11 units. It's like a theme for me. So what that means is armies that are pure MSU based but quite high damage. Let's say Sisters, for example, they're quite MSU based. They're quite high damage. Even though they don't get to reroll wound rolls, they can still do a lot. Armies like that, but also that can score quite passively. Sisters again, they can score quite passively. Necrons, they're quite an MSU based army. They can score quite passively as well. These kind of armies are a really big problem for 2 reasons. One, Votann just cannot compete on the secondary scoring, and very rarely can they compete on the primary scoring if something goes wrong in the game. Something that you don't expect. Maybe you have a bad turn and you lose 1 more unit than you anticipated. You're going to start losing the primary game as well. So MSU armies can cause a lot of problems. Like GSC, I think, is probably one of the best counters to Votann right now. They have high damage and high MSU use. So that for me, so things like GSC, Sisters, Necrons, anything that has MSU and high scoring is really difficult matchup.
Have you tested against, for example, Dark Eldar? Because historically and throughout the edition, they have been an MSU army as well.
Yeah, so actually, before the nerf, we did do a 3 Hecaton Land Fortress build versus Dark Eldar rack spam. And you'd think you'd lose the primary, but that didn't really happen. Actually, it was a 13-7 win for Votann on that one. I think
But that was like a Coteries Raxpawn list?
yes, exactly.
All right. So
Um,
just a completely different pivot than that.
yeah, I don't think Dark Eldar necessarily are gonna. I mean, Dark Eldar do have a lot. They can obviously wound on a 4+, etc. But I'm not really had a game against them since that, but I don't think that they're one of the more difficult armies because at the same time, outside of rack spam, you can also bully them on the primary. And the fact that their primary, one of their biggest strengths is their mobility. However, if you've got a list that has high mobility as well, you're kind of negating one of their biggest strengths, basically. And you can kind of just blow them off the table.
I see, I see. I mean, they have been getting worse and worse, let's say,
Yeah,
during the ninth edition. I mean, they had their time in the light, in the spotlight. So screw them, in my opinion. I mean, I am a Space Marine player. I don't enjoy myself any elven builds. They can go to hell.
exactly. They had 1 year of just crushing the meta. It's this time they just sort of got forgotten. But with that aside, yeah, I don't think the thing about them is they're not a passive scorer in my eyes, like Sisters or Necrons. They
Yeah,
can't just
definitely not.
exactly. And I think that is the big problem, and that is why they aren't as a problem for Votan because you can still your problem with scoring can match their problem with scoring, and you can probably outscore them because your kill secondaries are better than theirs.
Just basically push into them, right? And
Exactly, just
they
bully
might not
them.
have the necessary output to take you out of the board.
Exactly. I think Votan is very efficient in their damage. That is their second strength, is their efficiency. And an army like Drukhari does actually crumble because AP doesn't matter. Volume of fire matters, and they can put a lot of volume in there. So I think
Okay.
that's why, they struggle.
What about Tyranids? And I want to talk about. I mean, for me there are actually 3 Tyranids builds going around, which probably will be surprising to many people listening because many people when we are talking about Tyranids often default to the kind of David Gaylord, Ines Wilson list of which is Leviathan, Flyrant, 2 Warrior Bricks, support chaff like Zoethrop, stuff like this. Basically, this default Leviathan list, which has been doing absolutely amazing, of course. But there are 2 different lists that have been making their rounds around, especially Polish meta, for example. And I'm talking about the variations of the German WTC build, the Leviathan Super Mortal Spam list, and a Kraken list that has been proposed by, I believe, Vladi, has brought it up to the recent Polish Team Championship and has done extremely well with it. How do you find those specific matchups?
I think the Kraken build is probably the hardest to play against. So the Mortal Wound build, yeah. So the Mortal Wound build is quite difficult because especially if they're using spore mines on a dense table, you can't avoid the spore mines.
Just for our listeners, again, you can those lists that we are talking about, of course, are published on the recent or of the sources that had the PC list in them. That list from the recent Polish Team Championships can be found on Tourney Keeper, our previous episode that is published on YouTube discussing the Polish Team Championship. Will have the link to that as well. So any like specific archetypes, because I don't necessarily want to dive into them and discuss that list. So if you want to check exactly what we are talking about, you can find them there. Continue, sorry.
Yeah, so I think so actually, funnily enough, I've not had the most difficulty with the Mortal Wound spam list. Apart from people spamming spore mines, because they're quite hard to avoid, especially on a dense table. However, zone thropes are actually not that difficult to avoid in the sense that you can outrange their smites. And then if you use runes and you stage around decently placed runes, then you can sort of play around the zones, and once they pop out, you're going to kill them. They die really quickly against a lot of volume of fire, especially if they auto wound.
Yeah, auto-owning just shoot through just chew through the terrains, right? I mean, it's exactly the thing you want against the transhuman army.
Exactly, and so against Leviathan builds, I'm not finding it too difficult. Of course, there's always going to be a good player, a good Tyranids player that can mess up your day and fuck up the army, but I don't really feel like it's the biggest challenge. I think Votann might edge it out about 12-8, I would say. That's my experience. It might change as we play more and we go against better players, but that's my experience so far. Vladdy's list is the problem.
So what is actually Vlad's list like basic? It's a Swarm Lord, a Flyrant, right? One Harpy, I think.
Yep, one harpy.
Just a shit ton of Raveners. Just with OPSEC, out-advancing 2 zones or 1 squad of zones?
Two squads of three, yeah. 2 squads of 3 zones.
2 squads of 3 zones both, so a lot of mortal wounds output as well. Interesting, yeah.
So the problem with Vladdy's list is it's that pure volume of attack from Raveners, and they are AP4. So if the problem, yeah. So like I said, Votann, I've got 11 units. I need to be able to trade higher than them. So I need to be able to do like trading 1.5 units per one of my unit to be able to keep the momentum going. Because every loss of every unit it hurts a lot, because you don't have screens, you don't have action monkeys, you don't have supporting you have supporting functions, so you don't have just pure volume, etc. So every time you lose a unit, the army gets the difficult percentage to win that, and the recovery it gets harder and harder. The problem is
it's basically a super elite army right now, in essence.
It's a super elite army. It's a Custodes level army with a lot less wounds.
Yeah, and even like Custodes have chaff, at least some sort of it. They got the sisters. Like even Space Marines have servitors or like a random speeder storm. Rest in pieces, empty speeder storms. I will still miss you to this day. But Votann don't have that at all. Like literally, the closest thing they have to that is like a unit of 3 bikes, I think.
A unit of 3 bikes, but this is the problem: is bikes are so good, they're one of your prime damage dealers.
Exactly. So you really don't want to take like a 3 of them to throw around. Instead, you would bring the big squad to deal damage with, right?
Exactly. And so the thing about the Kraken list is he can just throw Raveners forward. He can give them obsec, so they can challenge your primary. He can throw them forward, give them obsec. He can give them full rerolls to hit if he needs to. Then, so he throws them forward. He advances them. They can charge. They can turn off your Overwatch with psychic powers, which obviously they're going to get off because it's Tyranids and they're all in a 3d6, etc. So then they go and attack you, but then they overrun back. And then they overrun back into safety. So that 1-to-1 trading, that 1 to 1.5 trading that you need to do to ensure that you don't lose momentum and your recovery process is healthy, you actually lose that because they've traded with you, they've gone back, and then you've got to reposition in an awkward angle to shoot them, and you then open yourself up to even more of this abusive play back into your units.
Yeah, so essentially they didn't trade, right? They just got a 3 kill.
Exactly. They got a free kill, and you can't really. It's really difficult to play around that because so it's really difficult to play around that, and that's one problem. Then you've got to deal with the zones. You've got to deal with the Harpy, the Flyrant, and the Swarm Lord. And I just don't think that Votann have enough units to be able to deal with all of this. Meanwhile, you can't do anything about the Psychic unless you've got a Grimnir, but they're gonna do a lot of they're gonna get their Warp Ritual without a problem, and they're just gonna swarm you, and I just don't think the army can recover, especially when Raveners are AP4. And that's pushing you on your invulnerable saves if you've taken Emir, which you really should at this point because you have to. So they just kind of, considering they're quite elite as well, they kind of out unit, they've got more units than you can deal with.
All right. So thank you for that. And we've discussed the bad matchups. What about the ones that you would potentially want to catch in your pairing process, something that you want to position your Leagues of Votann's list against, and something that you can just smash off the table?
Okay, so let's have a think, right? So I'm right now. I think it's fair to say Votann are a good attacker, not a good defender.
Okay.
I think that we should probably talk about that. I think they don't have enough solid matchups that they can be a defender. They're getting more and more yellows or more and more oranges than I would like them to, because mortal wound armies just wreck them.
Yep.
And I'm
So
also
basically,
having
when sorry to interrupt you again. Just a quick explanation. Something that we will be talking a lot in those podcasts about is the greens, the yellows, the oranges, the reds. What we are talking about is filling out our estimation matrices. I think we should definitely do like a whole episode about the team preparation for team events. How do we prepare for them? And generally, one of the ways that you definitely should and would prepare for a big event coming up is filling your estimation matchups against certain teams and certain armies, which basically give you a matrix of what do you want to play against, what the specific list wants to play against, and what they will struggle against. And because you have those matrices prepared for like the best teams, for example, you will be able to use that tool as a pairings tool in which you will be able to do your pairings. So we have defenders, we have attacks. Defenders are something that you put up, sorry, and that your opponent will attack with two different lists, and you will choose one of them. So defenders, we are talking about armies that are able to um, reliably score most of the time, even when being attacked by a counter to them. And attackers will be something used to pin those defenders of your opponent, so something that you are betting on smashing, even if they choose the table because they have that opportunity. Yep.
absolutely. I didn't realize that we're not at that episode yet.
Yeah, I mean, that is something that I will be definitely splicing into our stuff. I will
Mhm.
definitely be trying to do a whole episode on that format. But I also think, currently, because of all of the team event stuff going around, more and more people are aware of how this exactly works.
Absolutely. I think, yeah. And if they listen to more of our podcasts, then they'll definitely understand how it works.
Very nice plug. This is what I like.
You are welcome. So back to what we are saying. So I've mentioned that Harleys can be a problem, but elves are something that I would tech into. I know I've said this before that I think things like Craftworld Eldar is going to be a problem for this army entirely. However, because of their pure volume, but I think I would definitely tech into beating things like Harleys. Not even beating. Beating's not the right word. You can't consistently beat Harleys, I would say. No, I don't think many armies can. But you can definitely build a list that can go as an attacker to Harleys that are defenders and try and take points from them. And I think that's really important. So stopping
Okay,
the Harleys
but
getting.
but that is a very like a techy proposition and something you would probably pivot into. What are actually like pairings that are completely good? Like something you are definitely smashing on the table and that you might encounter.
I mean, the obvious ones are knights. Knights you just smash. Like my most recent game, Imperial Knights were table turn 2. I won first. They didn't get bonds up. They died.
It is kind of an obvious matchup, similar to I think Tau, right?
Yeah, that's very obvious. So the next kind of matchups are things like Death Guard, Space Marines, anything that is also elite, but they don't quite have the output or the survivability that Votann does.
Mm-hmm.
So Death Guard are very expensive. Yes, they have -1 damage to a lot of our damage too, but they don't have the volume or the ability to trade at range that Votann does.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a matchup that is really good into Space Marines, because Space Marines are Space Marines.
You say that to me, I just
I
won.
know. I'm sorry, man. You'll get your second codex. Don't worry.
Well, hopefully. Actually, hopefully not. Actually, I don't want the second Space Marines Codex.
No, you want to wait till 10th edition.
Never mind, never mind.
Um, but yeah, no. Space Marines, unfortunately, yeah. There's a lot of damage too. You can get a lot of high AP, a lot of volume. They just collapse. Astra Militarum, obviously. Admech, they're in a bad position. But then things like Orcs, I think Orcs and Tau, I think this army is a really good against.
Ooh,
And I think
Tau. Interesting. I
Tau,
was
yes,
thinking that is very interesting because, I mean, especially in the teams format, right? They are a complete powerhouse. It's something that you will see in almost every team. because of just the proposition of them picking a light table and smashing everything that comes against them. So you actually think that properly built Votann can go against Tau, for example, on a light table?
I think they can. I think they can. The thing that they can do absolutely is that they can outrange Tout Crisis. Obviously they can't outrange a Hammerhead. Hammerheads are a problem. But then there's not really many tables where you can go on and not hide turn one from a Hammerhead.
You say that, but from my experience on a light table with Exemplar of Carrion, it can be difficult to hide even against a Hammerhead. I am just like I am not saying you're wrong because I have no experience in this matchup whatsoever. What I was theorizing about is how do you actually deal with that? What each Hammerhead popping one of your Sagittars, just one shot, one kill. I mean, it is a swingy proposition for Tau definitely because they will not be rolling the wound roll. They just will not. So they need to actually make that 3-up wound roll each and every time. So 1/3 of their shots, like one of 3 hammerheads, will statistically not wound and will not do anything. But even then, popping 2 such darts from hammerheads can be.
What you can do to tech into this is you can take the Brocade Ironforge Master, whatever it's called.
Yes, of course. Yeah. You bring that every time, yeah.
Exactly. That absolutely shuts down any hammerhead that they throw. They've got one shot. Statistically, 2 out of 3 will hit. And one of them, you just say straight away, say no, 0 damage.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that, in fact, I think Land Fortresses are really good in this matchup because they will do more damage to the enemy than you will do Tau will do to them. But let's say I'm not taking a I'm not taking a Land Fortress. Yes, you've got to play around the fact that there are hammerheads. However, you've got a lot of shooting into Crisis, and you're going to mop up Crisis very quickly. If you can get 3 tokens onto Crisis, you're gonna do so much damage that there's not enough saves that they can make that you can, because it's all damage too.
Yeah, it does make sense, right? Because more often than not, Tau are focusing on those blobs of crisis, for example, or basically, even if you're taking Riptides, as some of the recent builds have turned into, I think you're still focused on killing with those big units, either they're hammerheads, even planes or Riptides or crisis blobs. They are units that they will be killing multiple of yours. It is something that they base their plan on, so you will be able to stack the tokens on them no matter what, I think.
Absolutely. And let's say somehow by some sheer magic I get like 2 tokens on them turn 1, I go first and I can see a drone or whatever, and I've got say 6 Sagittars, that's 72 AP, 2 damage, 2 shots, all strength 6 or 7. So the odd times that you don't auto wound, you're wounded on 3s, and that's a lot of shooting. They can put down 1 crisis squad in one go. And if you take that crisis squad out, then pretty quickly, then you've got a lot. They're going to struggle quite a lot, I would say. But not just that though. You've got a lot of mobility. You've got a lot of range, and yeah, if you've got the Brocade, you can quite counter their hammerheads quite easily. And their planes, if you're sat in transports, yeah, their planes can do like say 6 mortal wounds each. I think is it to a vehicle a maximum of 6?
I believe you are throwing 6 dice, yes, at the vehicle.
So statistically, they're not going to kill any of your infantry because they're not in a vehicle. Because they're all in vehicles, so they're going to do some damage to a vehicle, and they might blow one up with the
Two
shooting.
planes, yeah, 2 planes statistically should kill a Sagitar, right?
Yeah. If he's 6 on a 4+, that's 3 each. So that's 6. So he's got 3 wounds left.
Yeah, sorry, they are 9 fucking wounds left. So yeah, but they will deal some Monsters. They'll probably one will finish the buff. So
Yeah, absolutely. They'll finish one off. They'll probably
I
get
mean,
one
they are
super low.
soaking damage at this point. So this is exactly what they are supposed to do.
Absolutely. They're soaking damage, and if you lose even 2 and you've got 4 left, and you still got bikes, you've got a high chance to do something. So I do think there's a lot of play into Tau. I've had 4 games post nerf against them, and I've won 4 games comfortably. However, I have got some test games lined up that I want to try, especially as we're seeing an emergence of Riptides, for example. So I want to do some testing to that. I see that we are moving away from the massive crisis brick, and a lot of people are trying to play around riptides. Weirdly, but yeah. But also one of the biggest, if they're not Tau, they're also Farsight, and their rerolls to wound just do nothing as well.
Yeah, that is true, right? The
So
the general exemplar of Monka is just null and void, and
exactly,
is a huge force multiplier for the Tau.
absolutely, you're taking away one of their Tau are good because they're efficient, high damage, efficient shooter, and if you take that away, or you hurt that a little bit, and you cut that some of that off, then they don't do as much damage as they need to, and that is my experience so far. Is I can kill the crisis squad turn one quite comfortably, especially if they have to poke out and try and be aggressive. If they go first turn, the crisis squad and the planes will die, and then it's just playing around the sort of line of sight angles from the hammerheads whilst you get closer and closer to finish them off. Because if you get your 34-inch range or 40 inches with if you're Emir with their strength 6 weapons, and you can put the hurt on them, and you can kill them comfortably at AP 2 damage too.
Super interesting that they like I'm seeing this the more you explain it, that they can actually make a complete beating, like they can probably just smash out like the current builds. Of course, there's always like evolving meta involved in what the tower are actually bringing, but yeah, the basics are definitely there.
Yeah, I tried the 15 Ein here into them, and they surprisingly did really well at killing the crisis as well. When you've got full rerolls and you've got like 5d6 AP2 grenades, that obviously you're gonna have the full 30 shots, and then you've got the 15 shots Volkite. With that can do mortals. You're re-rolling. Your charge, you ignore the -2 to charge, etc. I think a lot of the army is tailored into beating that one. Votann are really good at beating big blobs.
Yeah, exactly right. They struggle against MSU, but they by default, as with knights, they just bully the big things.
Exactly, exactly. So
Just removing it's kind of like an old Elder especially played this way. I mean, Hail of Doom played a very similar game
mhm.
in which if you have the Doom the Jinx on you, then you're dead. It's the same thing with Votan. You have the Judgment tokens on it, you're goddamn dead, and I'm sure.
Exactly. So that is exactly right. That is exactly what I've sort of found out is any any army that takes big blobs, and they take hyper focus units, I will just destroy. But any army that is MSU based and they've got speed and they've got damage, they will also trade a lot better into Votan than they will vice versa.
So uh I will just run you through some armies I'm like thinking about, and you can tell me like maybe 2-3 sentences of what generally is your opinion on them. Especially some of the newer codexes, I think like that they are unsolved at the moment, and it might be a very interesting take on that. Chaos Demons, for example. What are you think?
I think Votan have the edge, especially if you use a Terminator. Just take 5 Einheirs with the relic to stop deep strike, and I think you win the matchup.
I think so. I think this is just the deep strike denial, especially on a such tanky unit as Iron Hero. Although I think the Mortal Wounds output that Demon can provide might prove difficult, so that is an interesting one.
Yeah, you've got to be able to play around it, but I think it's still definitely a winnable matchup.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Space Marines. We are of course talking about billion builds at this point, but generally, what's the vibe here? I mean, if you generally, just so you know, it is a difficult question to just assess every single matchup. It is something that you would do before every tournament and assess to a
Yeah.
specific build, and I'm painfully aware of that. So if you are unsure, that's completely fine, because that's, I think, also important for our listeners to understand that sometimes assessing a matchup without playing it even like 10 times is quite impossible, or playing as
Mhm.
a very specific build with a skilled opponent. So that's fine. Like, really, don't feel pressure to give me a straight up answer that you're not sure of.
No, I have an answer for CSM. MSU CSM will win,
Hmm.
and I think like bigger blobs, Terminator blobs, things like that. I think Votan wins.
Yeah, this is because what we've discussed previously, right? That
Exactly.
completely makes sense.
Exactly. They get the 4+ auto wind up and just start shooting, or they've also got the mobility to move around such blobs. But I played against Emperor's Children, and I had a really difficult time dealing with their um, MSU approach to noise marines.
Interesting. Okay. Necrons, the big one at the moment. Very strong in team environment, very strong in general.
I honestly, if the players were matched, I don't think Votann has a chance. It just cannot outscore it.
But I mean, I've played against Necrons like once or twice. Of course, see, I played with the broken one, with the super cheap one. But their offensive profiles are really nice into them.
Yeah, the offensive is really good, especially when you can ignore dense, you can ignore light cover, which is one of their biggest defensives.
The 2 damage into things like destroyers, the scarab, stuff like this is very nice.
It is. I find that it's just too easy for them to just deny points on primary, and I find what I've realized post nerf is that if they play aggressively, deny you points for 1 turn or 2 turns, and then go to a defensive approach, is really hard for you to win.
Yeah.
Because that's all they need to do. Because they're going to score their 45 no matter what you do. So they just need to deny you on the primary for 1 or 2 turns, and mathematically you can't win. And that's what I found. If they play aggressive, Votann will wreck them. But if they play smart, they play passive. Votann are going to struggle.
I see. All right. More or less, that's every army. Of course, not every army. I think there are like 1,000 suns left.
There we go. You've now asked about Thousand Suns.
1,000 suns. I think. I mean, I'm a 1,000 suns player, and I think the army. It's an actually interesting matchup. I think, especially now that some of the 1,000 suns lists are pivoting in demons,
Mm-hmm.
which I think gives us a lot of play into that. I honestly, like as a 1,000 suns player, as someone who understands Leagues of Votann, I believe at least semi well. Like I'm not an expert by any means, but I at least understand what the codex does. I think it's a close and undecided matchup for me. I would need to actually play it on the table to completely understand.
I think we should play it so you can see. But I think Thousand Suns edged this one out. If it was pre-nerf, I would say the negatives of Thousand Suns, Votann can just punish.
Pre-nerf, I think there's no chance. I think
Yeah,
there's just too many units, and 1,000 suns are extremely elite and expensive.
exactly.
But especially now, my builds have pivoted into heavy MSU,
Hmm.
and I have a lot of Mortal Wounds output. So
There
I
you
think
go.
this is something that the Votann don't like to play against.
Post nerf, yeah, exactly. Post nerf, Votann need to screen something. They need to screen the Alpha Strike teleport with all the mortal bombs, because if they get enough mortals off turn one, the army is there's no way to win. So they need to screen something, and I think right now there's not enough points to just throw like you can throw 100 like 10 warriors in the way to try and stop that. But even then, that 140 points or 145 points, I think is just too much. I think it's a small win for Thousand Suns.
Interesting. We will be playing that, by the way.
Yes.
There's no way in hell that we aren't. All right, so we have the matchups more or less covered. We have also discussed that you consider them to be an attacker more than a defender
Hmm.
because they have such swingy matchups, let's say. I mean, swingy is not the correct word here. They aren't stable enough against some of the armies that may attack them
Hmm.
to feel comfortable as a defender, let's say.
Absolutely. I think they're quite an extreme rock paper scissors is how I'd put it. The
Yep.
matchups they're really good at. They're really good at, but the matchups they're not good at, I think they is quite a problem.
All right, so that's a very good like transition into what I wanted to talk about next. How stable are they? Meaning, there's two things in that questions I like that I want to discuss. First one, if they get a bad matchup, because sometimes you just cannot avoid a bad matchup for an army, right? Mm. And if it comes to that, are they able to scramble for points, or are they gonna on a bad matchup, which the worst matchup that they can possibly get, which would be, in your opinion?
Worst matchup for me right now is probably Mortal Wound Tyranids or Necrons.
I see. Okay. So let's say they get paired against the Necrons. Can they scramble for points, or are you bringing like 1 to 0 points?
I don't think there's any game where Votann will get 0.
So it's not like Harlequins against Tau.
No, I don't think so. It's not. I don't think it's like that because at the end of the day, they still do have some decent survivability, and they still do have quite a lot of damage output. So they're always going to force. They're never going. They're always going to be able to achieve something. So whether it's like for Necrons, they'll still get their no prisoners points because they'll still do a lot of damage. They'll still be able to, I guess, maybe do the grudge is secondary because they'll be able to go and kill something in melee because they have the damage. I don't think they'll ever get 0. So they're never gonna. I don't think they're gonna have a red pair in essence, but I think they'll have quite a few oranges. If
I see.
that answers your question that way.
Yep, definitely. That's perfect. Thank you. And what is their scoring potential? How, if they get a good matchup, for example, how can they actually punish the matchup? And what scores can you expect from the good matchups? Like, are they bringing 20s? Are we talking, I mean, a 13, maybe 14 maximum?
I think I would compare Votann to GSC in the sense that they were 12 to 15. However, they were a little easier to play than GSC. But I've rarely had a 20-0 because it's just, yeah, I've just rarely had a 20-0 because they don't really have a 45 secondary potential.
I mean, there are armies that are probably scored that against. I
Yeah,
mean,
all right. So
Knights, for
outside
example,
of
right?
exactly, so outside of Knights, yeah, Knights I've got a 20-0s at. Like I did one against Space Wolves 2 days ago. So there is potential, but like I think there are armies that a lot of like I mean, apart from maybe Knights, but Space Marines, a lot of armies can get 20-0s at. That's not really where the value is. I think so yeah, Knights, yeah, they can get really good points at. But outside of that, a lot of matchups are light green. I realize that people don't understand our green system or our color coding system. So let's say 12 to 15 is probably their sweet spot, I would say.
I see. That's interesting. All right, so moving on to the next thing that's very much connected to that, the pivot potential. So we've discussed for in your opinion the strongest build right now. Do you see right now? Obviously, that's again a very difficult question to ask. Do you see any potentials for them to flip the bad matchups? This is kind of being one step ahead of the meta because they are still a new army. But let's hypothesize here and say you are completely 100% correct on your estimations. The Votann has been figured out and they are getting smashed by Necrons or Tyranids. Do you see any potentials for pivots? Something that can surprise your opponent. That's something that just isn't obvious in the codex. And that can flip those matchups? Or are they an army that's because of the depth and the amount of data sheets that they have, will have trouble adjusting to that, and they are kind of dead then? Because, for example, the meta shifts and they have like 1 or 2 bits that they are stuck to.
So I assume my estimation is going to change over time.
I mean, of course it is. It is just a hypothesis at this point, so don't worry about it.
Okay, here's where I think. Right now, I think although there's like 12 data sheets, I think the book is phenomenal in the sense that I could build a build that does say well versus Harleys, but crap versus Tyranids. But then I can build a build that's good, really good against Tyranids, but crap versus Harleys.
Okay, so they are versatile.
I think they are very versatile because I've got like 3 lists that I'm rotating constantly between, and each lists the big bads that they're good against are all different, and the big bads that they're all bad against are all different.
That is very interesting and very useful.
Yes, because of how the army works and how the playstyles constantly change based on what you throw in there. The stratagems, the different leagues, and the power potential of each unit is so good. It's such a good internal balance book that yeah, I think that there's just versatility into everything.
That's very nice to hear. Like this, it's an incredible strength of the codex if it can actually pivot so well into different matchups. It just gives it so much more lifeblood, especially talking about team formats and what they can bring to the table.
For teams, that's fantastic. But right now, I'm struggling to think of what I want, which list I want to buy for our November tournament. So it's a good and bad thing.
Okay, so the very big summary of that we'll be definitely discussing, are we bringing them to certain team events? Let's start with big 8v8 formats. You have 8 slots in your team. Are you bringing Leagues of Votann to that?
Yeah, at first I would. We need to. Yeah, it needs to be tested. I would definitely take it. I think there's a lot of potential. I think the problem with it though is you need to discuss what is required for them to build, because you need to build obviously to counter. It's not like Tau where you just take Tau and say, right, we're going to take Tau. They've got that one list, we'll take them. Or Harleys, we've got our 8 boats.
All right. So more than anything, they are, because they are wide, they are unsolved, especially at the moment. You are building for purpose here.
Exactly, you're building for purpose, and that is, but their purpose is good, and that's why I would take them, because their potential for countering something is strong. But you need to figure it out which one you want to build into.
Okay, and what about smaller team formats? Let's say 6v6 or 5v4v formats. You have less slots here. You need to be more versatile and much more like all-rounded, I think, because you can't allow yourself to have like, if you encounter a team that has just great, generally strong armies, you might not have a good pivot and like good slot to counter against, and it might be a struggle in your team pairings, right? Would you bring them to that one?
So yeah, this is definitely a meta question. So it all depends on entirely what the meta is looking like and what we're expecting in the meta.
So let's talk about meta, Polish Team Championship meta.
Let me pull it up.
So if you had the opportunity to bring them to the recent Polish Team Championships, where Tau was very prevalent, Harlequins were super prevalent, Tyranids actually not so much. Only from the top teams, only Vladi took them. Most of the very many knights, I believe.
So to answer you now, if I look at the DMP and let's say the top 4 teams, I would take them, because I'm looking at there's maybe on average 2 bad matchups out of 3, and I think that is quite. And the obviously against 3 good matchups, it can be consistent in what it brings. Like I say, 12 to 15. So I think I would take it on that basis.
I see. So basically, in the currently in Polish meta, there are good matchups for them and the most teams, and that like the obvious team composition, the good team composition should be good for Votan to counter and to
I
slot
would say so.
against.
Absolutely.
Very good. All right. I believe with that we will be wrapping this episode up. I think we discussed very in depth, even more in depth than I was I think expecting. So very super thank you for that and for all your insight. That was
You're
great.
welcome.
Thank you for time as well. And thank you everybody for tuning in and listening to our podcast episode. Hopefully you learned something useful that will help you achieve success in your upcoming events. And big thanks to our sponsors, Hegeman Shop and War Tiles. They are supporting us constantly. Uh, and with that, I will see you in the next episode. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Danny.